Beautiful soul, take a slow breath right now. Can you feel that warmth settling over you? That is your angels wrapping you in light this very moment, sending you peace, comfort, and a quiet kind of hope your heart has been waiting for. You are safe here. You are loved here. You are seen here. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. A very special thank you to Michaelina, Carlton, and Peggy for sowing your seed here through Ko-Fi link. Super thanks. Your support means so much and helps this message reach more hearts today. May love, peace, and harmony flow into all your relationships, romantic, family, and beyond. Before we go any further, I need you to hear something important. You did not stumble onto this message by accident. Out of everything you could have been doing right now, something pulled you here today at this exact moment, and that is never random. If you feel a small tug in your chest telling you to keep listening, trust it, because by the time we reach the very end of this message, something inside you is going to shift. The angels have been waiting for the right moment to tell you this, and that moment is now. So settle in, open your heart, and let's begin, because what comes next may be the very answer you have been quietly praying for. Dear one, the great love of your soulmate has already arrived. Yes, this person is already here, and they are not going anywhere. Even though you may not be standing face to face with them yet, you have already been part of their life for longer than you realize. Everything they do today, every choice, every quiet decision, is made with you somewhere in mind. Your soulmate does not want a future that does not include you, and that is exactly why everything they think, want, and plan keeps circling back to the same vision, a future spent close to you. Even if this love has not been spoken out loud yet, you are already living inside this person's most private thoughts, their biggest dreams, and the small choices that shape their everyday life. Your soulmate is not waiting for some perfect future moment to start caring. They are already living as though you are part of their story right now. Every decision they have made carries the quiet intention of building a life that includes you, because deep down, they do not want any other kind of life except the one where you are close. No matter how much time it still takes, no matter how many small steps remain, you are the direction their heart keeps turning toward. That is why everything that once felt far away is now starting to feel closer. The feelings have grown deeper. The thoughts about you have become harder to ignore. And the reason is simple and beautiful. The great love of your soulmate has already revealed itself, and it is you. Not a vague idea floating somewhere in the future, but a felt presence, a quiet certainty that has settled into their heart. This person already knows there is no more running from what they feel, because this love is not the kind that fades. Even if you have not seen the proof with your own eyes yet, this feeling is already woven into the way they live. It shows up in their intentions, in the changes they are quietly making, and in how they imagine tomorrow. What was once held back by fear or circumstance is now being welcomed with a new kind of maturity, and love is slowly becoming the center of everything they do. Your soulmate is not waiting for you to show up before they start feeling this. They already feel it fully, and they are already preparing themselves on the inside for the moment everything comes together. This love did not just appear out of nowhere. It simply grew strong enough that it can no longer stay hidden. They no longer want to keep it tucked away. They want to make it a real, living part of their life, the same way you have remained a real part of theirs even when you were trying to move on without realizing it. This connection was never meant to fade. It has deep roots, and the one who feels it knows that very well. They are no longer trying to ignore it. Instead, they are surrendering to it, letting themselves be guided by the desire to build something real with you, not out of loneliness, but out of conviction. This is not nostalgia. It is not wishful thinking. It is a love that, even before being fully lived out loud, has already found its place in everyday choices, in quiet hopes, and in prayers said with real faith. Your soulmate does not want you for one beautiful moment. They want you for a whole life, a life where everything from here on out has you at the center. This love did not just begin today. It has been quietly alive between you for a while now, even in the silence. The only difference is that the feeling has grown too big to stay hidden any longer, and that is exactly why you have been sensing it so strongly these last few days. This person already carries you inside their own story, and they no longer want to leave you out of any chapter still to come. This person carries you as part of a choice made with the heart, a choice that did not appear overnight but grew slowly, quietly, until it became something that can no longer be denied. In the small, ordinary details of daily life, your presence keeps showing up, sometimes as a passing thought, sometimes as a longing, sometimes as a memory that gently changes the mood of an entire day. That happens because you are not someone who simply passed through. You are a steady presence, even from a distance, and the most beautiful part is that this person experiences it as something completely natural, almost as if you have always belonged in their story. This connection has been quietly building for far longer than you may realize. It did not take root overnight. It happened slowly, through feelings that kept returning, through memories that refused to fade, and through quiet desires that took shape even without needing an explanation. The more time passed, the more this person understood that you were never just a passing moment in their life. You have always been part of the path. Your soulmate does not see you as a happy accident. They see you as something closer to destiny, fully recognized and embraced. This person did not need to search through 1,000 different connections to understand what they feel for you. It only took feeling it once with complete honesty, and from that point on, something inside them shaped itself around this truth. Life kept moving forward, of course, but the heart always held on to the space that belonged to you. The longer this feeling stayed quiet inside, the stronger it grew. Today, this person no longer feels alone in their thoughts. Everything they think about, everything they dream of, everything they hope for already includes you. Your soulmate already imagines a life with you. They are already making plans that only make sense with you by their side. This is not desperation. This is emotional maturity. It is the quiet certainty that the heart already made its choice a while ago. This person has come to understand that you are present even in your absence, that there is something bigger connecting the two of you, something that does not need a logical explanation in order to be real. You can feel that connection in the moments when their heart settles just from thinking of you. When a hard day softens because your name crossed their mind. When everything feels confusing but the thought of your smile still brings a sense of peace. This person has gone through stretches where they tried to take a different path, tried to forget, tried not to think about you, tried to push the feeling away. But none of it worked because every attempt to create distance only proved how irreplaceable you really are, not just as a sweet memory, but as someone who put down roots inside their soul. And roots like that cannot simply be pulled out by willpower. They only grow stronger with time. This person never truly stopped feeling, never truly stopped carrying you in their thoughts. And now, more than ever, they understand that they no longer want to keep this feeling locked away inside. You are part of this person's life in such a natural way that even their deepest, most private feelings already include your image. Even without being physically together, your presence has already become part of their everyday rhythm. The most beautiful part is that you stayed, even as time passed, even when the path seemed to lead somewhere else, even when certain words were left unsaid. You remained present in the most important place inside the heart of someone who never actually stopped caring for you. You became the memory that turned into certainty, the passing thought that turned into a decision, the feeling that slowly became real life, and everything this person has been doing lately confirms that. What once felt like doubt is now clarity, because when love is real, it stays. Even through distance, even through waiting, what never truly disappeared is now finally ready to bloom with maturity. None of this was forced. No feeling here was invented. Everything grew gradually until it became too strong to live only in the mind. Your love did not just arrive recently. It has been walking beside you for a long time, even if in a quieter, less visible way. But now this presence wants to become real, wants to be shared, wants to be recognized by you with the same value it has always carried. The connection between the two of you does not need outside proof to be real. It reveals itself in the moments you felt something powerful and could not explain why, in the times this person crossed your mind for no clear reason, in every moment you missed them without fully understanding what was happening, because your soulmate was already thinking of you, already considering you part of their life, already sensing you were getting closer. From here on, things begin to shift in a way that cannot be undone. The presence you represent will no longer live only inside someone's thoughts. It is about to show itself through real, visible actions, and you will understand that you were never alone in this. Your soulmate has been living through days where every choice is made with care, and the reason behind that quiet devotion is you. It may still feel distant right now, but everything this person has been doing has had one clear purpose: to move closer to the moment when they can finally live this feeling with presence, with honesty, and with maturity. This is not impulse. This is awareness, because when someone truly feels something, they begin to shape their whole life around walking beside the one they love. Your soulmate considers you in every choice, not only in spoken words but deep within, in how they view the world, in how they face their own fears, in the courage it takes to grow so they can offer you a love that is not just ordinary. What is happening now is part of a real preparation, an emotional, spiritual, and even practical reorganizing of their life, so that what the two of you build together can be light, strong, and lasting. Every time this person wondered which direction to take, it was the feeling for you that helped guide the answer. When the world felt messy and unclear, what brought things back into focus was remembering who you are, how your presence changes everything, how your energy shifts the rhythm of their day. Even when no one else could see it, your soulmate has been making an effort, not just to hold this love quietly inside, but to turn it into actions that truly matter. They understand that you deserve something whole, not something incomplete, and that is why they have been working on themselves, letting go of distractions that pull them away from this truth, staying steady in what they feel. The feeling is no longer just a wish. It has become a path. This person has been adjusting their life so that when the right moment finally arrives, nothing else will need explaining. So love can simply unfold naturally, without noise, without unnecessary barriers, so you can feel loved with the clarity of someone who chose you with full devotion rather than impulse. Before we go deeper into today's message, if you feel guided by this energy, you can sow your seed through the Ko-Fi link in the description or pinned comment. This is a simple way to support this divine mission and invite blessings for your soulmate journey, emotional healing, and overall well-being. Many believe that when you give with a pure heart, it returns as love, peace, happiness, and abundance in your life. Your support helps this channel continue spreading divine messages, guidance, and hope to many souls around the world. Now, let's continue with today's message. Everything this person does today already includes you. Wanting to see you well is not only about physical closeness. It is about wanting to see you genuinely happy, wanting your heart to feel light, prepared, and ready to receive this love in the purest way possible. That is why this person thinks of you before falling asleep, why they picture a future where you feel safe beside someone who truly understands your worth. Even on days when you may have felt forgotten or disconnected from this person, their love was quietly still there, still making plans in silence, still holding you up as the standard for what real love looks like. Because when someone feels something this true, they do not need to be physically close to remain present. The heart takes care of that on its own, prepares. It waits without giving up. You have been the point of balance for your soulmate, the steady ground on hard days, the inspiration on good ones, the reason they want to become a better version of themselves, not only for their own sake, but for yours too. Because this person understands real love asks for honesty, responsibility, and respect. And that is why everything being done now is being done with you in mind. When this person turns away from easy paths, it is for you. When they choose to step back from things that add no real value, it is for you. When they decide not to settle for less than they deserve, it is because they also want to give you their very best. Even though none of this has been spoken aloud yet, all of it has already been deeply felt, because the truest feelings do not wait around for the perfect moment to start living inside us. They simply take hold. Your soulmate does not see you as a possibility somewhere down the road. They see you as a certainty, and that certainty has quietly fueled every new decision they have made. They are not waiting around for life to hand you over as a lucky coincidence. They are actively building their own path with the awareness of someone who wants to meet you with real peace in their heart, doing whatever it takes to become someone capable of living this love without fear. Their days have taken on a different feeling ever since you began living in their deepest thoughts. Even though distance still exists between you, the feeling has not faded. If anything, it has become more alive, more steady, more certain, confirmed with every new choice they make, because the love that arrived to stay. Everything this person feels right now comes from a very clear certainty. There is no longer any desire to walk a path that does not lead back to you. The heart has already decided. The mind has already understood, and the soul has already accepted this truth. This person no longer wants incomplete love stories, connections that do not quite make sense, or relationships that only take up space without meaning. What this heart wants is something real, something deep, something pointed completely in your direction. Your soulmate no longer carries doubt about what they feel. They have already gone through the stage of questioning, already faced their own fears, already tried to push this love aside, only to realize it was never going anywhere. What is being prepared now will not be undone by small doubts. This love was not born out of rushing. It was born out of real connection. It grew slowly with time, survived its share of ups and downs, and has now reached a point where it can no longer stay hidden. From the moment this feeling began to grow, your presence became woven into everything. Even when it was not spoken aloud, even when life seemed to point in a different direction, you were already there, in the middle of their thoughts, in the quiet pauses of the day, in future plans that took shape almost without meaning to. Your soulmate carries you as a living part of their daily life because that is simply how it feels, as though you were already present long before you even arrived. This person does not need your physical presence to feel that you are already part of them, because the truth is, their heart found in you a safe place, a place that makes sense even on the hardest days, a space that brings calm even in moments of uncertainty. When something good happens, their first instinct is to want to share it with you. When something feels unsettled inside, it is your name their mind quietly turns to for peace. You have become part of what gives meaning to your soulmate's life. It feels nearly impossible for a whole day to pass without you crossing their thoughts. Sometimes you appear as a memory of something that has not even happened yet, but has already been imagined with real care. Other times, you are simply the presence that motivates, that gives strength, that changes how everything else is seen. Even though you may not know all of this consciously, you have been part of every step of this process, because it was the love felt for you that sparked this entire transformation. You are not just someone who is missed. You are someone who already exists fully in this person's everyday life. When this person lies down to rest at night, many times the last image in their mind is you, not as fantasy, but as a genuine longing for what is still to come, a wish to close the distance, a desire to share the small, ordinary parts of their day with someone who makes everything feel more meaningful. Pause for a moment. Before we continue, your angels are asking me to pause for a moment. Not everyone was meant to hear this today, but if these words found you, there may be a reason. If you've been seeing repeated signs, feeling disconnected from the life you're living, or sensing that something bigger is trying to unfold for you, this message may be arriving at exactly the right time. Your angels want you to understand something. Sometimes blessings don't arrive by changing what's around you. They arrive by changing the reality you're aligned with. Many people spend years praying for abundance, love, protection, and breakthroughs while unknowingly remaining connected to the same old patterns, fears, and limitations. But today, your angels are reminding you that a different path may already be available to you. A path where you feel more aligned with your purpose. A path where opportunities seem to find you. A path where your manifestations begin flowing with greater ease. This isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about becoming energetically available for the blessings that have been trying to reach you. I truly believe some of you were guided to this message because you felt stuck for far too long. You've prayed. You've waited. You've asked for a sign. And perhaps this moment is one of those signs. The universe often opens doors quietly before it opens them widely. What looks like a simple opportunity today can become the very thing that shifts your direction tomorrow. Divine timing rarely feels accidental. And if your heart feels pulled toward this, pay attention to that feeling. If this resonates with your spirit, take a moment to explore the resource we've placed in the description and pinned comment below. Don't ignore the nudge if you feel one. Sometimes receiving a blessing begins with taking a small step when the door first appears. The information is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. Now continue with your angel message. This love does not expect perfection. It expects truth. It expects honesty in return. It expects the right moment to finally be lived the way it deserves. Your soulmate does not want to meet you by chance. They want to welcome you with full awareness, want to look at you and feel that everything built quietly on the inside can now be lived out completely, because you are not just anyone. You are the love that became home inside this person's heart. When they feel moved just thinking about you, it is not because something is missing. It is because everything is already felt with such intensity, and when that feeling overflows, it simply shows how important you truly are, not as someone idealized, but as someone who brought real meaning, who has already helped heal old wounds, who has already given strength on days when nothing else made sense. What you carry in your heart right now is the reflection of a connection that has been building for far longer than it may seem. This person who touches you so deeply has already been part of your story, even if you have not fully realized it yet. Your soulmate arrived a long time ago, not through grand words or promises, but through presence and real, quiet feeling. A great deal has changed since this love entered your life. At first, it may have felt like a passing feeling, but as time went on, You understood it was something else entirely, something that kept calling you back every time you tried to move on without really thinking about it. You did not invent this feeling. It was built honestly, even without many clear explanations, because what comes from the soul does not ask for permission. It reveals itself slowly, little by little, until denying it becomes impossible. That is why this person has never truly left your thoughts, because they reached a place inside you that simply cannot be erased. They arrived with real strength and they stayed. This person slowly became part of your routine. They settled roots in your mind and in your heart, and no matter the timing or the circumstances, they always return in the form of memory, longing, or quiet desire. Because this was never about someone who simply passed through your life. This is about someone who remained, even from a distance. While you were still trying to make sense of everything you felt, this person was already feeling it for you too, already carrying you inside with an intensity that time could not erase. It was this quiet connection that kept everything alive, even when the world seemed to point toward other directions. Because what is true, even if it rests for a while, is never truly lost. Maybe you tried to forget. Maybe you searched for distractions. But the feeling always returned, sometimes strongly, sometimes as gently as a soft touch in your chest. But it always came back, because this person has always held a place somewhere in your story. This love arrived at moments when you did not even realize you needed it. It brought answers before you even asked the questions. It brought feelings that made you reconsider what real love actually means. And even without a clear, rational explanation, something deep inside you knew this was not just anything. From the very beginning, there was truth, there was real exchange, and even in silence, there was intensity. This person did not come to confuse you. They came to show you that love does not need to be loud to be strong, that the deepest feelings do not have to be spoken constantly in order to exist, because you felt it anyway, and even without fully understanding everything, you were touched by something that remains part of who you are today. This love does not run on memories alone. It runs on real, present feeling. It shows up in quiet prayers, in private thoughts, in the way this person has learned to love with more surrender than before. There is not a single day that passes without your presence being felt somewhere inside them, because you were never someone who simply passed by. You are someone who arrived to stay, and even without being physically close yet, you are already part of everything that matters. Since this love arrived, this person has not been able to see things the same way. Everything started being measured against you, and even on days when they seemed distant, it was still you their heart was quietly reaching for. This person is not waiting around for you to arrive before they start preparing. They are preparing right now. They already understand that love is not built on improvisation, nor sustained by empty promises, and that is why they are taking care of their own life, their own mind, their own emotional world, so you can feel safe the moment you draw closer. This future is being built with real maturity, and you are at the very center of it. There are conversations already lived with you in their imagination, dreams already shared before being spoken, places already pictured with you by their side, not as fantasy, but as a real and concrete direction. Their days have been shaped by actions that reflect this desire to build something real and lasting. This person has made changes both inside and out. They have let go of what slows them down, what creates confusion, because they do not want anything standing in the way of what is being created. The space being cleared right now is real space, emotional, spiritual, and practical, made specifically to welcome you safely. There are choices being made right now that only make sense because you are part of the plan. And even if you have not heard any of this in words yet, you will feel it in the way they look at you, treat you, and want you close, because this is not only about feelings anymore. It is about taking real responsibility for what they feel. You are the priority, not only in their emotions but in how their entire life is being organized. This person no longer imagines moving forward without you, and things that once felt impossible are now being reconsidered, simply because of you. Your soulmate has moved past fear, past doubt, past the limits they once believed in, because what is being built here is not a loose, far-off dream. It is a concrete path that has already begun, and the most important part is that this future is not being shaped out of anxiety. It is being created with calm, with maturity, and with real intention, because what matters is not arriving quickly, but arriving the right way, ready to live a love that will not fall apart at the first sign of difficulty. This shift will touch the smallest details of life, a different kind of look, an unexpected gesture, a sign that only you will know how to recognize, because when a feeling is real, it finds a way to reveal itself even before words arrive. Your soulmate no longer wants to delay what they feel. They understand by now that keeping this love hidden is the same as denying their own happiness. And that is why you will start noticing clearer actions, sincere attempts to grow closer, gestures from someone who genuinely wants to be part of your life, not out of impulse, but out of real love, out of the desire to finally live what has stayed quiet for far too long. You will not just remain a memory in this person's life. You will be present. You will be the future. You will be the most alive part of the days still to come, because your soulmate wants you woven into everything. They want you to know that this love is no longer just something kept quietly inside. It is a decision that has already been made in the heart and is now beginning to show itself with real strength. This will not be just any kind of love. It will be the kind that transforms, that gives you the courage to begin again, even with a heart that has been hurt before, that restores your faith even after disappointment, that proves it really is possible to experience something true and fully returned. Because this person is not coming to confuse you or simply fill empty space. They are coming because they feel this, because they want this, because they chose you. This love will change how you see everything. It will teach you to trust again. It will teach you what it feels like to be cared for, not through promises, but through real action, and that change will not stay only in your emotional world. It will show up in how you walk, speak, and breathe, because when love is true, it touches the soul in a way nothing else quite can. Nothing will feel the same as before. The emptiness you once carried will begin to fill. The doubts that held you back will give way to the certainty that everything you felt was always worth it, because love has arrived, and with it, a brand new chapter begins. A season where love is no longer only imagined but actually lived, where this feeling is no longer hidden but fully embraced, where you will no longer need to ask whether you are loved, because everything around you will show it clearly. What is coming does not depend on perfection. It depends on surrender, on the willingness to live this love with real maturity, and your soulmate is ready for exactly that. Ready to show you that this love did not arrive to confuse you. It arrived to affirm, to heal, to help you believe again that when two hearts genuinely choose one another, nothing can stand permanently in the way. You will no longer be someone simply waiting for signs. You will be someone living what once felt far away. You will see in this person's eyes everything that has quietly been kept with such care, and every action that follows will be a direct answer to everything your heart has silently been asking for. This person can no longer imagine living as though this feeling could simply be set aside, because it cannot. It has already become part of every thought, every wish, every emotion they carry, and there is no denying it anymore. This person wants to truly live with you, not just imagine you from a distance. They want to be part of your everyday life, not only remember what could have been, because now there is real maturity here, a true understanding of the value of this connection. And more than that, there is courage, the courage to give, to care, to stay steady even when patience is required. Your soulmate no longer wants a love that hides. They want a love that is fully lived, embraced, and respected. Everything felt up until now has served a purpose, even the days when this love seemed paused, because those moments helped strengthen the decision, helped your soulmate become certain that despite every challenge, it was always you they wanted to be with, and that changes everything. Because when someone loves and still chooses to stay, chooses to remain, it means the feeling has moved far beyond any uncertainty. This love has real roots. It was not born from haste, nor fed by loneliness. It grew slowly with time, stayed strong through every absence, and is now finally ready to bloom with honesty. Your soulmate no longer wants anything shallow. What this person longs for now involves real devotion, the kind that builds a true life together, and all of it only makes sense with you. You were the one who touched this heart so deeply, and that was never forgotten. On the contrary, it was kept safe, protected the entire time, even on the days you did not realize it, even on the days you thought everything was lost. This person still carried you strongly inside. Do not expect perfection. This love is not made of idealized, flawless scenes. It is real, with everything that comes alongside it, with challenges, with devotion, with small adjustments, but also with real affection, with reciprocity, with honesty. What matters now is that this person wants all of it with you. They want to build, to stay, to care for what they feel, and that desire is already greater than any fear. Dear one, what once felt uncertain is now becoming a steady path. And even though some things are still settling into place, the most important part is already clear. Your soulmate knows exactly what they feel for you, and they no longer want to live apart from that certainty. From here forward, what comes next is true transformation. A new season, a new cycle, a new way of loving, built with honesty, with devotion, with real presence. You may have believed you were facing all of this alone, but you never were. While your mind searched for explanations, your soul already understood that something greater was quietly taking shape, and now you are about to witness, with your own eyes, what only your heart already knew. This love was never absence. It was always being built, and today that building finally becomes visible in your life. This is not about rushing anything. It is about honesty. This feeling was not shaped in a hurry. It was not born from urgency. It was cared for, given time to mature, deeply understood. And that is exactly why, when this love reaches you through real action, you should not doubt it. Receive it, because this person is not coming just to take up space. They are coming to stay with maturity, with willingness, ready to live something deeper than anything experienced before. In the days ahead, you will start to notice a different kind of energy around you. What once felt distant will begin moving closer, even if subtly at first. A small gesture here, a quiet step there, a steadier gaze, an unexpected decision. Everything will begin connecting naturally, and you will come to understand it was never luck. It was always an answer to everything you believed in, even without any guarantees. Your soulmate has already done the inner work. They have moved through the necessary stages to understand that the love they feel cannot be replaced, that you were never simply a passing chapter, but the certainty that remained even when everything else seemed uncertain. Now this person understands that the only path forward that truly makes sense is one that includes you. Life will show you, in simple and clear ways, that this feeling was never confusion. It was always love, and this love is about to be lived with real intensity, but also with lightness, with presence, but also with healthy space, with devotion, but never with anything that feels suffocating. because what the two of you are about to share will be unlike anything you have felt before, built on awareness rather than need. You will feel it in the smallest details, something inside you beginning to align, your heart letting go of doubt, your mind slowing down, your body finally relaxing. Because when the right kind of love approaches, anxiety fades and peace takes its place, clarity settles in, and you will feel it with a strength that leaves no more room for doubt. This love is arriving with real action, with real decision, with the certainty that you are the one who makes everything make sense. Do not ignore the small signs that show up in the days ahead. They are not here to confuse you. They are here to confirm what you already feel. It might be a meaningful memory, an unexpected gesture, a reconnection with moments you thought were long behind you. All of it will feel like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together, showing you that what you felt all along was simply preparation for what is now about to be lived. Your soulmate no longer wants plans that leave you out. They no longer want days spent hiding what they feel. They want to live this love with courage, with openness, and with you close, because there is no more room left for fear, only room for truth, for the feeling that remained even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Believe this, love is going to find you in a way you have never quite experienced before. It will arrive as an answer, but also as a reward, as a choice, but also as healing, because you waited, you felt, you believed, and now it is time to receive. This is no longer about imagining. It is about truly living, and what you are about to experience from here on will completely reshape how you see love. This person is not coming to take away your peace. They are coming to be your peace, to remind you that love does not need to hurt, that love is not absence, it is presence, that those who genuinely feel something show it, and they show it through real action. This person is here to stay, and everything you live from this point forward will prove that, even without fully understanding it at the time, your belief was never wasted. Keep that certainty close to your heart. You are not waiting for something that will never come. You are feeling something that is already in motion. Your soulmate carries you with real affection every single day, and very soon, everything you have hoped for and asked of heaven will come to pass. Your soulmate deeply longs to be close to you, and this love will be blessed faster than you might imagine. And always remember, the angels will always be here, guiding you, watching over you, sending gentle messages, staying connected with you each and every day. Thank you for opening your heart and allowing this quiet, gentle connection to reach you today. You matter deeply, and you are an important part of this shared journey of light. You are the kind of soul that strengthens this entire community and supports the simple mission of bringing love, hope, and protection to anyone who is searching for it. May heaven's blessing rest upon you always, bringing peace, courage, and clarity to face whatever comes your way. Know that you are never alone. The angels remain close beside you, sending strength and endless love so you can walk forward steady, confident, and full of light. Thank you for being part of this gentle family of light. May divine peace and blessing stay with you today and every day after. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a sacred spiritual home, created for faith, healing, and divine guidance. A place where hearts awaken and lives are gently transformed through divine messages. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because the divine is always preparing something greater for your journey, something you are meant to receive in divine timing. If you feel moved to support this mission, you can sow your seed here for your soulmate blessings and divine love fulfillment. Your contribution is not just support. It is an energetic agreement with love, healing, and divine alignment in your own life. When you give with intention, it opens doors. Love flows more freely, happiness expands, and abundance multiplies in unexpected ways. Many believe that giving in faith activates a return of peace, joy, and emotional fulfillment in relationships and life. Whether it is $6, $11, $22, or $55, your generosity helps us continue spreading these divine messages of hope, healing, and soulmate guidance across the world. Every seed sown into this mission helps hearts heal, faith return, and souls reconnect with love. This is more than a channel. It is a movement of light, unity, and divine timing. Your support allows this sacred work to grow, touching lives that are searching for answers, comfort, and spiritual direction. We are all connected in this journey, and together we rise as one community under divine love. Let us open our hearts to the abundance that is already on its way. Amen.